Welcome, everyone, to Career Happy Hour. It's Andrew Beach, Executive Career Coach. I help professionals like you communicate your value to fight great opportunities faster. And this is a first for our FAQ Friday crowd, the folks that join us for Career Happy Hour. It's the first time I've ever had a guest on the show. And so stick around. You guys are in for a treat today because I have Terry Smith, one of the most revered HR leaders in at least the Portland metro area, and I'm sure somewhere on the globe. He's also got a following. But I would encourage you to actually share this broadcast with everyone you know. You probably have somewhere a following. So click the share button wherever you might be right now. And if you could, please share that with everyone you know. We had some issues with broadcasting to the events page on LinkedIn. So hopefully you'll see this. In fact, I might head over there just momentarily, so bear with me so I can get that posted in the right place. For you that are interested in joining us from the event page, so we don't want to create any issues there. As I get to the event page, bear with me. Let me know where you're joining from. There is a chat here, so we're excited to have you with us. Let me know where you're joining from, and if you have any questions about career transition, interviewing, market planning, anything of that nature, I'm more than happy to answer, and I'm sure Terry will have some good perspectives. Good. You're looking for work. Thank you, John. I appreciate you joining today. So let's see if I can share this over to my event page so that people don't get left out in the cold on our broadcast. So here we go. Let me see if I might just see, this is the first time I've actually broadcast to an event page. So I want to make sure that this is working. So I'm going to go ahead and post it here. And hopefully people will be able to see that it's gone live. There we go. Okay, so we're good on that side. All right, so our topic today really came as a conversation between Terry and I. We had reconnected here in the last month, and it really was a great opportunity for us to share some thoughts, some ideas around recruiting and hiring in the era of COVID. So why don't I invite Terry into our conversation here, and we'll do some introductions, and then we'll go into a conversation, a dialogue about where the future is headed. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Terry Smith. Terry, tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your background, and fill in our viewers here on your situation and how you came to be, I guess.
How I came to be.
Your origin story.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This is a real joy and an honor to be your first guest on this program, and I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you. I come to this with over 3 decades of experience in human resources in Silicon Valley, overseas in Japan, and a bit here and there throughout the U.S. and the last 20 or so years here at home, where I grew up in Portland. And so worked in a wide variety of different industries in the HR field. So I've had a lot of exposure to a lot of different types of practices and so on. So that's me in 18 and a half seconds.
Nice. And you worked with a number of leading firms in the Portland metropolitan area, at least that I'm familiar with, and have led teams not only as a senior HR executive, but also a talent acquisition. And I think that's really the perspective, Terry, that we're looking to get from you today. And a lot of the folks that join are certainly candidates or people that follow me because of the advice and the information they can get on being ideal selected candidates, if you will. And so that's kind of the perspective I think you and I were thinking about coming from today. And as relates to, the thing that's at the top of my mind, at least for the candidates that I'm talking to, is what do we do now? We've been work from home. What does talent acquisition look like today from your perspective?
Well, that's a broad topic. I'll approach it first from the standpoint of what do we as candidates do now. I think one of the key things that, and this is should be any particular surprise, but one of the key things is really staying in touch with and leveraging your network, and being just creative about how you go about doing that. Asking questions around who in your network knows people in their network, and how do you, how would you be willing to introduce me or somebody like me to somebody in your network, and to think creatively not only about just how that connection can get made, but also, what are the things that in a conversation I would have for the first time with somebody who it may be a very exploratory thing, how do I want to approach that conversation? And I really encourage us all to think in terms of approaching it from a business to business kind of relationship rather than as a candidate to potential employer relationship. There's a subtle difference there, but it's an important one, because there's always going to be a bit of a perception around particularly brand new contacts where the person being contacted is kind of wondering, okay, what's this person want, right? And so more than anything else, it's about learning and about really trying to understand what are the organizations that you're interested in, what kinds of work are you interested in doing, and how can you creatively think through your network of professional contacts to tease that information out. So from a candidate perspective, it's really about thinking creatively, and particularly in these times, we have to be creative, because standard things that were in place 3 months ago simply don't apply today. It's very interesting to look at it from the perspective of, really, it is May 15th, and on January 15th, none of this was on the horizon the way it is now. On February 15th, it's happened so quickly, and so it's a huge shift.
Sure. And from your perspective, are you thinking then that really talent acquisition teams and candidates are really on a level playing field that way, that it took everybody by surprise and we're both trying to adjust to a new normal, and compassion is maybe something that we all could exercise, as frustrating as it is to do online applications and job search in a traditional method, recognizing that the compassion component is really important.
I think that's a really good point. And yes, I think there is a bit of an equalization, because, so let me frame this a little bit. The simple fact is that the unemployment picture in the United States is, we all know, right? It's the worst it's been since the Depression, and it literally happened overnight. And where we come to now is a point where there are a lot of jobs that just don't exist, and there's a lot of people out of work looking for jobs in a wide variety of categories. But the temperance to that is that there are a lot of organizations that are still hiring, perhaps not as quickly. Some are scooping people up right and left because they're identifying different ways to approach their business, and they're identifying different aspects of their business that they may not necessarily have the talent in place for, and so they are hiring. And I would encourage everybody to go take a look at the list that continues to be generated on LinkedIn of companies that are hiring. They may not necessarily be hiring the position that you are intrigued with, or at least they don't have it posted, but that's a great opportunity to start a conversation with somebody in one of those organizations. This has so thoroughly shifted the way we think about our everyday lives that organizations that are being thoughtful about this and are trying to adjust and be successful in this new strange world are trying to do the same exact thinking. And so so because it's so different, and because there is a talent pool out there that is gigantic, their opportunity is to approach that the right way and to bring that talent pool to them. So I do believe there's a bit of leveling, and I think you're spot on with your thought around compassion, right? This is a very strange time, and we need to adjust to it.
And along those lines, as a candidate, a lot of the folks on this particular session are candidates. you know, uh, what sort of things can they expect to change from the talent acquisition side? What are we seeing there? What are you seeing as a change that a lot of the hiring teams might be making?
Right. So I think the key elements to it are a recognition that we were forced into, essentially, that the model of working from home and remote work is a model that absolutely has to become part of the fabric of how we work in this country and really all over the world. And so talent acquisition teams are having to pivot to some degree, in some cases, towards that model. I worked in an organization for a number of years here in Portland where we substantially grew our remote workforce, and we took some very specific steps to go do that. One of the things that we did, as an example, was we upgraded our applicant tracking system twice, actually, because we needed it to be more robust and more functional than it had been previously. So we went through that exercise. We engaged with vendors, and there are a ton of them out there, who can provide services around remote style screening, remote interviewing. The group that we used for many years was HireVue, and they do a tremendous job of that kind of thing. And so from a candidate perspective, what I think you will see is more organizations relying on electronic methods for this process. Electronic, obviously applicant tracking systems, which we like to think are kind of the norm, but may not necessarily be in all cases or in all industries. So we have to be, industries need to be conscious of moving to that kind of platform. And then we have to be conscious of how we interact with and address those platforms, how we apply online, and then how we work with the information that's available to us. So as an example, if I were to find a company that I was particularly interested in, let's say it's Amazon, just for the sake of it. Well, I'll go online, I'll apply for a role, and I will also leverage my contacts in LinkedIn to say, hey, my LinkedIn contact from Amazon, I just applied for, or I'm about to apply for, I'm very interested in. Can we talk about how you might be able to connect me to the right people and so on? And I think particularly in larger organizations that are continuing to hire through this process, I think there's more of an appetite for that kind of outreach, that personal touch, than there might have been even a few months ago. Just because the conditions are so different. From a process standpoint, just by virtue of the situation we're in, there's going to be a lot more online interviewing, a lot more electronic first round interviews, second round interviews, maybe even final round interviews. I would contend, as we think about looking towards the future, that the on-site interview, particularly in the first stages of interviewing, is probably going by the wayside. That as we start to get the situation under control, I think more and more organizations will rely on and fall back on electronic interviewing as a means of really getting to final candidates efficiently, quickly, but with the understanding that even at that point, I mean, if the world continues the way it is, even at that point of final interview, it may be an electronic remote process. And then from a systems point of view, what we can expect, what I'm sure a lot of people have experienced and what we can expect going forward, is that the entire onboarding process, the job offer, the reference checking, the background screenings, all of those things become electronic. They're things that we don't touch. When we go to the onboarding process, the whole onboarding process, the company I work for right now has a very efficient candidate portal, and coming through that portal is extremely smooth. I experienced it last year, and it's just tremendous. And more and more organizations are going to move to that. So that should become an expectation from the candidate point of view, that you may not ever actually, in some cases, meet somebody face to face. Electronically, yes, but it may be a long time before you actually get to sit in a room with people.
Good point. I mean, that certainly is going to change the world of interviewing for sure. I am seeing several candidates, though, still being invited for on-site interviews. So that's something to think about is, how do we manage the logistics of say, and on-site, and as a hiring team and also as a candidate, what are the protocols that we think we should be considering to make that a reality?
Well, that's an evolving thing. Obviously, it's going to become sort of more common knowledge and best practice as we move forward. But I would certainly suspect that at the very least, we would want to modify how we require people to wear masks during the interview process. I know that seems kind of odd, but it's something that I think is a real thing. The interview process itself, if it is on site, may be in large rooms or in large space situations where we don't get to sit across a table from each other, but we sit across a carpet from each other and have that conversation that way. Certainly any organization that's going to be involving people in sort of moving in and out and around the company are going to have to think about how to appropriately and properly disinfect, right? If somebody's coming in for an interview, let's disinfect the interview space. After they leave, let's disinfect the interview space. Let's make sure that anything that they've touched or that they've, handled, if they do, gets wiped down and sanitized and so on. I would suspect that there would be articulated pathways so that, for example, if I'm going to an interview on the second floor, that I'm maybe taking the stairs with my host and that my host is leading the way but keeping a safe distance, and that when we sit down, or when we go to the whatever the space is that we're going to be in, that we're walking on a distinct pathway that's marked and articulated so that the traffic is being guided appropriately. I mean, those are sort of little things that are, but they're all about being aware of and being conscious of people's sense of safety and sense of cleanliness. And these are things that I believe we're just going to have to get used to doing.
And so I guess from a candidate's perspective, what sort of questions do you think they might want to ask before they show up to an interview to ensure that some of these protocols might, be followed in some cases, but companies may not have given that much consideration to these thoughts that you just shared?
Yeah.
Is it possible we might suggest that candidates ask those questions? Like, is there distancing protocols? How are you handling these things? And is that a reasonable ask for a candidate?
Well, I think it is, and it's a great question. I think it's a very reasonable ask. This is something that we're wrestling with even as we start to think about reopening gradually some of the, facilities in the state and so on. Is that I would certainly want to know that the employer that I'm going to work for has enough kind of consideration around these things, and that they're concerned enough about the health and well-being of the employees in the organization, that I do want to know that they're doing that. And if they're not, then as a candidate, I think it's perfectly acceptable. And I know this is kind of heretical, just because you never want to actually encourage somebody to turn something down, but I would certainly think twice if I was in the situation and I said to whoever it is that I'm going to visit, what are your protocols for cleanliness? What are your protocols for foot traffic? What are your protocols around masking and things of that nature? And depending on the answer I get, will tell me quite a bit about the culture of the organization. If the organization is just not paying any attention to any of those things, that culture worries me. I saw a great webcast earlier today from Hewlett-Packard, actually, and HP is really conscious around these sorts of things. It was a presentation by the CHRO of HP, and she was very conscious around culture and how we express how we feel about our employees through our behavior. And these are behaviors. And so these are important questions to ask. And I would encourage candidates, if they are in that situation where they're being asked to come on site, ask. That will tell me a whole lot about who it is I may be going to work for, and help me to decide whether I want to.
Yeah. Well, and as you can imagine, I'm sure that one person's interaction with that candidate may not be an indictment on the entire organization. So what I always encourage candidates to do is take all that with a grain of salt. Maybe even keep your eyes and ears open. That's just one indicator. That one person may have had a bad day. I mean, these things happen. You and I know that.
Sure.
And even in your hiring process, as perfect as your systems might be, you don't always execute the way you should. And my suspicion is that it's going to become more critical in these days for companies to establish their value and their candidate experience, because they're going to have a lot more applicants for their positions. And so,
Correct.
what do you see as a way that companies can actually handle that part of it? So, because I'm thinking from a perspective too, Terry, is that I'm sure there's a lot of CFOs out there that are licking their chops saying, wow, this work from home thing is great. We're getting good productivity numbers. We don't have to increase salaries. We might even be able to think about lowering our overhead and capital expense on real estate. I mean, I'm thinking a lot of these different things are going to have an impact on candidate and employee experience that people haven't considered yet.
No, I agree. I think we're just scratching the surface on this. I think there's a lot more to come, and I think there are balances to be struck. All of the points that you make are great points around cost and around employee experience, particularly employee experience. I think there's a great story to be told by organizations that choose to blend the experience. One of the things we're talking about at our organization, for example, is how do you schedule the workspace, right? How do you schedule it in such a way so that you have distance available, so that you have a structure where people can, feel like there's a safe ring around them, if you will, a safe bubble. And in so doing, how do you also begin to skill up some of your leaders in terms of how they manage people in that mixture? So you've got half of your team is on site 3 days a week, the other half is on site 2 days a week. What are the systems that you use? Things like morning huddles or daily stand-ups or one-on-one meetings or what have you, that encourage open dialogue and open communication, so that you're operating with a sense of understanding of not only how people are feeling about this, but the reality of a lot of unknowns, right, around this thing. So I think what that does, and again, it's that behavior-based reaffirmation of our culture. Our culture is that we believe in our people. Our people they are our asset. They're the heart of what we do. Let's act like it. Right?
Yes, live your why, as Simon Sinek might say.
Yeah, exactly.
Display that everywhere.
Yep.
In the way you act and on your bulletin boards and everything else. Your internal marketing, that sort of thing. I'm also thinking from a candidate perspective, what kind of new bias mechanisms might be activated. I had a candidate ask me the other day, do you think people who are impacted by COVID and this virus, maybe their jobs were lost during this time, may have preference over, say, a candidate that was displaced last year that has just taken longer to find work? I start thinking about all these different, I don't want to call them stigma. I think that's a really strong word. But I think there's a lot of things that are going on now that are causing people pause and concern in that category. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you see it played out in the news in very hyperbolic ways. But I think what it winds up coming down to with sort of the day-to-day is that there's, I think, going to be a natural sort of tension, not necessarily fear maybe, but tension around, people who have experienced this event, people who've had it happen in their family or people who've had it happen in their household, and they've survived it and they've gotten through it and they've, maybe even have built antibodies or whatever. And then how do their peers and their colleagues react to that? And particularly if the issue is that the person may have gotten ill while they were, say, on furlough, and now they're coming back from furlough. Okay, are we going to treat that person differently than we treat somebody? And obviously everything that is possible to be done around, HIPAA requirements and confidentiality of medical conditions and things of that nature should be in place, and should be followed. But the fact is the rumor machine is going to work the way it works, and people will say, well, gee, so and so had that, and now what does that mean for us? And so I think there's the potential for that, and I think where HR can really be the value add in this is managing that messaging and managing those concerns and helping people with information, and with data that says, look, here's this, here's this, here's this. But it's not, the opportunity for the HR leadership is to be the voice of reason, the calm voice in the crowd.
And I have to imagine, along with that, Terry, is there's a lot of folks that are just thinking, you know what, I might not ever go back to work. I might just decide not to work there anymore. And so I'm always the one to see the positivity in many situations for a candidate, and that is many of these people who choose not to go back to work create opportunities for others to have work. So
very much so.
That's something I think about a lot. And right now I think there's a kind of this lull in our how would I say it, work from home, right? People went through that norming, or what is it, storming, norming, and performing, right? They went through the learning process of work from home, and now they feel pretty settled, and they're maybe kind of liking this, and they're at least used to it. And then there has to be maybe a transition back to the workplace, and I have to imagine that's going to create some anxiety and issues. But I'm looking at it from a candidate perspective, saying, we have a lull right now where people are really comfortable working from home. They're not going on a commute. They're not commuting on a daily basis. They're taking lunch at home. They're probably working technically more hours, but they're also isolated and thirsting for connection. And
right.
And so a lot of the candidates that I work with are just like, oh, I don't want to bother them, or all these excuses about why they shouldn't connect. And the opposite is true. Everybody that I've reached out to has really appreciated it when I did. So I don't know if that's what you're experiencing or not, or if you've had any tips or tricks for our candidates in doing outreach that way.
Well, yeah, and in fact, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I've done some of my own outreach just over the last few weeks, just to start to make connections and to reconnect in a lot of cases. And you're spot on again with your observation that people really are very responsive to it right now. I think just because of that sense of isolation, this enforced isolation, that's the worst part of it, is it's enforced. It's not optional. And so I think people, very generally, I think people have a desire to make connections and a desire to, find ways to have human experiences. But you're right, there's going to be a lot of people, I think, as this starts to settle out, who will find preference in working from home, or in not going back to the workplace that they've been working in favor of some other workplace that may show up that may, suit their needs and interests more thoroughly. So that opens doors for candidates that may not necessarily have been open before, and I think that's part of the nature of how this will evolve. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how organizations allow themselves to be flexible enough to embrace this thing, which a year ago was kind of a work from home, whatever, wear your pink slippers and, that sort of thing. Yeah. And I mean, really, I've been in corporate level meetings where that's been kind of the attitude. Well, so-and-so's working from home, so they're having their coffee in their pajamas and they're not real, and so on. And, I also know people who are professionals at working from home. I have a colleague in Texas who has worked from home for the last 25 years, and he prefers it substantially, and he's extremely productive. He's a top sales rep for his company. So, there's a model there that does work. And I think part of the issue that as we start to re-engage this and as we bring more people online working from home is the sort of this line of sight thing, right? I mean, I can't tell you, and I'm sure you've experienced it as well, how many managers just have that need to see people in their chairs, right? And that to me is, this is an opportune time to really break that mindset. Because if we're doing a good job of leading our teams, and if we're doing a good job of setting expectations and level loading the work and all of those things, then we stand an excellent chance of having a highly productive team that can operate efficiently from home or from the office or both. We just have to be good about making sure we're managing all that, setting expectations, not catching people by surprise when changes occur, making sure that we're communicating those things. All of the fundamental blocking and tackling that management literature talks about is really acutely at play in this new model.
Absolutely. And I see that, so the trend that I've seen for the last 5 years is companies really consolidating in regional cost centers. And so, that means, a company that in a region might have had 15 offices, whittled that down to 5. Right. And they forced or shoehorned or encouraged everybody to work from that space or gave them a package to go somewhere else. Right. So what I'm seeing is that this has really kind of shaken up that model and said, okay, maybe there still is value. Because I remember back in the days when I was selling technology, and that was quite a while ago, that it was really kind of okay to work from home. And there wasn't anything but a satellite office with a phone and a couple of desks. It wasn't very big for the amount of people we had working in the area. And, so it was really okay to work from home. Then the trend was, okay, well, it's not okay to work from home. And in fact, we want you to move to a local center in the region. Are you willing to relocate? And now I think it's really opened the door, primarily because I think people are now skilling up in how to lead teams remotely. Because it's always, like you said, been line of sight, and it's much easier. And certainly there is some level of texture lost when you're remote like this, 100%. So it certainly isn't something I would advocate 100%, because I think there's things lost. You lose the heartbeat and the tangible nature that you get from being face to face with a real person.
Agreed. Yeah, no, and there are plenty of examples of organizational cultures that thrive on that connectedness and on that sense of building a team because we work together under the same roof and we play together and we hang out together and those sorts of things. And that is a challenge that is going to be an interesting thing to try and evolve as we go through this. But I'll go back to the model I was mentioning a little bit ago in the company that I worked in, where we grew our remote workforce much faster than our headquarters workforce. And we based the model on home offices because the customer base that we were supporting was scattered across the entire United States, and there were no concentrations anywhere. And prior to my being there, there had been a couple of examples where the company had a couple of regional offices, and they were in interesting spots for interesting reasons. But in any event, we disbanded those shortly after I got there in favor of the model that says, let's bring people into the organization who are proximate to our customer base. Let's not ask our customers to come to us, let's go to them. And that made so much more sense. I mean, just the change in the cost of travel, the cost of overnight stays, all those sorts of things. From a business point of view, that was a no-brainer. From a personal point of view, what we found, and in fact, interestingly enough, this group, I stood up an engagement survey at this organization for a number of years, and one of the things that we found was that all of the engagement scores, categories, and our Net Promoter Score were all higher in that group of field workers than they were in the headquarters office. Now, probably a lot of reasons for that, but I think that part of the connection that the people were able to make with their customers being so close, you can't overlook that.
And if any of you that are watching have questions for me or for Terry, please put those in the chat box, and I'll put them up as a way for us to talk through some of these ideas, Terry, if that's okay. But we're here to serve the viewers, and one of the things that came to mind, Terry, when we reconnected, is a word I put on my profile about 2 weeks ago before you and I reconnected, and that's this word synergize. For whatever reason, when you and I get together and we have conversations, I feel a synergy. So I really appreciate you coming on the show today, and I really am kind of meditating on that word synergize and all the things that come with Covey's 7 Habits. I've kind of been ruminating on all those things, like thinking win-win, and how can we seek first to understand, even in today's marketplace. So I do appreciate you coming on today.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity. This is great, and it is always a pleasure to spend time just talking about things like this with you.
Yes, excellent.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was a question from Chelsea. It says, if you came from a corporate career, what companies are popular right now in hiring, aside from Amazon, Intel, Nike, and the like, that we actually have probability of getting hired? So I'll leave that one for you. And then I'll follow up with my answer to that question, which is a little more, anyway, I have some views on that.
I wish I could say I had some specialized knowledge about particular organizations that are doing something, but what I can tell you is that what I've observed is that organizations that are in the business of any kind of consumer goods and so forth. You look at some of the things that they're doing at Home Depot, for example, and Target, and because fundamentally society still needs to do the things that it does through consumer consumption and consumer consumption, and so what those organizations are trying to do is trying to pivot towards how we can serve our customers in these environments, right? In this situation where we don't necessarily have the same, I think about the Target superstores, for example. They are these giant places, or Home Depot, you get lost in there sometimes. And the nature of Home Depot is probably not going to change that much, but you could easily see an organization like a Target or a Walmart or what have you, and I'm just picking on those folks because they're very visible to me, really making significant changes in the way they operate, to provide more flexibility and capability for their customers, right? And so I think there's some intriguing things there. I know those groups are doing a lot of hiring. The tech firms, Intel has tightened up quite a bit, but they are still hiring. A lot of the major tech players out there that whose business is, I'm trying to think of, some of particularly here's an area to think about, particularly organizations that provide services and support on the internet. Right? The internet has suddenly become something much different than it was even a couple of months ago. So organizations that are supporting that. So, Zoom, for example, not only they had their issues in terms of security and so forth, but that does bring up another aspect of it. Those organizations that are involved in online security and online capacity and all that sort of technology, that is going to continue to accelerate because the demand, the load on the system is just going to continue to accelerate. So those are just a couple of thoughts. What about you, Andrew?
Well, I think the answer to that depends, right? So my new, and not to talk about undergarments, but what I'm suggesting is that whenever somebody asks me a question like that, I say it depends. It depends on the job you're going after. It depends on your geography. It depends on your objective. So until we know more about that, we can only speak in generalities. Now, what I would suggest is that if you're going to exclude companies like Amazon, Intel, and Nike, then you're in Portland, you're excluding a very large chunk of employment opportunity. I'll just leave it at that. Now, I don't believe that the methods for effective search have changed. What has changed is the number of people searching.
Yep.
And what I suspect is going to happen is if we were replacing, let's say, I'm just going to use rough numbers because the market was so good for so long that maybe we got 50 applicants and we had one candidate selected, so 1 out of 50. My suspicion is we're looking now about 1 out of 300. So if you get 300 applicants on a rec, then you got a 1 out of 300 chance. Okay? Now, your odds significantly increase if you network into the organization. Okay? Because what we've recognized is that hiring manager networking is a 1 in 50 chance. A 1 in 2 chance, a 50% successful. Okay, so whatever you can do to either get to a hiring manager or someone who's a recommender, an influencer, a peer, right, somebody in the organization that could vouch for your expertise with trust, that's what I would recommend as an activity. So sometimes I get those as, these roles, they're getting 300 applicants in the first hour. Okay. If you participate in that, then you are in a very competitive situation. However, the road in networking is very, I don't want to say lonely, but it's not crowded. That's for sure. Many people know, Terry, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, that they should network.
Yes.
And that networking is important. And yet they don't know how to do it, and they don't do it. And so they already have looked at those opportunities and made applications and thought that was good enough.
Yeah.
So you can't just do the minimum anymore.
No, it's quite true. And as I was saying before, when you see an opportunity and you can utilize, your contacts, your contacts, and so on to make connections inside those organizations that you're interested in, you're much more likely to get past that 300 and into that group of, 8, 9 or less, right?
Yeah.
So, so there's, and you're right too, Andrew, networking's hard. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. But the alternative is you kind of just sit and wait for something to happen. It's not going to happen. You have to be proactive about it. You have to engage. And I feel for people who, I struggle with it as much as anybody does, and maybe more than some and less than others. But it is a challenging thing. You're putting yourself out there. But that's the whole point.
Absolutely. And so the next question here that I thought was really interesting, Terry, is something that you might have some input on here, is what's a great way to transfer skills from corporate to nonprofit during the pandemic?
Okay. I'm going to fall back on your comment a bit and say it kind of depends. It depends on what specific skills you're bringing. What I can tell you, for example, is having spent some time in the nonprofit world myself, nonprofit organizations really look for, in a lot of cases, that blend of passion and business expertise. That's really key. So if you're thinking in terms of, I want to make a transition into the nonprofit world, it behooves you to start with, okay, to your point, what would Simon Sinek say? Start with why. What is it that I am profoundly passionate about? You have the advantage in Portland of having hundreds of nonprofit organizations devoted to all manner of things. And they may not all be hiring for a particular skill set, but many of them are, and many of them will continue to do so even in these challenging times. What I hear most often is, people with good financial acumen, people that can bring, the capacity to help the organization run its business. Fundraising in nonprofits is always an important thing, right? That's fundamental. If you don't have fundraising, you don't have funds, and you don't have a nonprofit. So, somebody's ability to, I had a colleague, last year who really, really wanted to get into the nonprofit world. And what she brought to the table was a tremendous sales capacity. What she worked on was, how do I turn that sales capacity into fundraising capacity? How do I go from selling to asking? And it was really interesting to walk through with her that transition, away from sort of that traditional model of I sell a product to I am here to ask you to participate in this amazing nonprofit experience. And so that was a really good example of transitioning, and thinking in terms of how I take what I know how to do, and make it work in this other environment.
Completely. And so the challenge that you might have right now is that if you're looking for paid work in nonprofit, is that if we do have a decline in the economy, then there's going to be less philanthropy. I can just assure you that people are going to hoard their cash. That's just normal. And so you may decide that, yes, I want to do this voluntarily just to keep me occupied. There's always a benefit in doing some kind of pro bono work, not only for the person you're doing it for, but for yourself. So if you're in a bad situation and you don't feel good and you have a lot of doubt, you're not singing praises every morning, you might want to consider donating some of your time to someone who's less fortunate than you, and there's always someone less fortunate than you. But I got to thinking that one of the things that I think would be a good business opportunity right now is anything that could help companies transfer risk. And so what does that mean? Well, I think I would probably start a company that would help other companies actually reopen safely and have a whole business model around that with insurance. And now all these companies can transfer that risk to me as a specialist in that space. And so I'm not sure, I haven't heard of anybody doing that, but I'm sure there's companies thinking about it. And so if I was in any kind of business, that would probably be one of the things I would offer as a service, is to help companies do that safely, or as safely as possible.
Yeah.
Because I think that was one of our questions here. And really, you called out something I think that's important in terms of nonprofit. So private sector to nonprofit, that whole development piece, the raising of funds. If you're good at that, then you'll always have work. That's just been my experience.
No, I absolutely agree. Fundraising is the lifeblood of any nonprofit, and if you have any kind of a propensity towards that, of being able to develop those relationships to the point where you can ask for that big donation, that's gold.
Okay. Let's see. How to follow up on applications and connect with the correct person or the manager who is hiring. That sounds like just a common question we hear a lot, Terry, about people that, hey, I want to do more after I make an application, but what really is going to land the way I want it to and present my brand well? Any thoughts there from a corporate perspective on how to make that happen?
Yeah. So in terms of being inside the interview process itself, I know just from experience over years of doing this work that, whenever you get through an interview stage, whether it's first stage, second stage, whatever, just that follow up in email or follow up in text or follow up in, whatever medium is the right one based on the circumstances. Hiring managers appreciate that, and it is a differentiator. Not everybody does it, and particularly if you have gone through an interview stage and it's been made clear to you that you're not going to be going forward. Okay, that's disappointing. That's hard to swallow. But the flip side of that is that the opportunity for you is to, if you will, sort of be the bigger person. Reach out to the people that you've interviewed with and just say, hey, really appreciate the opportunity to spend time and talk to you about the role. I understand I'm not going to be going forward, but I wish you the best success in whoever it is that you do wind up hiring. I mean, that's just a nice message that is going to resonate with that manager. They may get 30, 60, 90 days into this new relationship and realize that, they blew it and just hired the wrong person. They're going to remember.
Minute, Terry, are you saying that talent acquisition and hiring teams make mistakes?
Yes.
Huh. And people actually leave in the first 90 days after they've been hired?
Yep. I've seen it happen. Yeah.
Fascinating. So that means
Yeah.
I should stay in touch whether there's an open position or not, even if I didn't get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. Now, granted, the odds on that are low, but it does happen. I have seen it happen. And it happens for any of a variety of reasons. I'll give you a good example. I had hired somebody on my team a few years ago who was commuting from Vancouver to downtown Portland, and this person had some schedule challenges and some child management challenges and so forth, and literally within about 60 days or so, came to me and said, this just isn't working well for me. I have these challenges, and I've been contacted by some people I know in a company that's a mile from my house, and I don't have to cross the river, and I don't have to fight for parking, and I'm really sorry, but this is what I need to go do. So, yeah, so it does, and I mean, the right person for the role, good person for the role, good synergy between the two of us, all that sort of thing, but just not right for that moment. And so had to start over and went back to the pool that I had originally tapped into, and there were a couple of people who had in fact done that exact kind of follow-up. So I just reached out and said, so things didn't quite work out the way I wanted them to. Would you still be interested in talking about this opportunity? And 2 out of 2 said, yes, I'd love to. So it's not so much necessarily that, so I'll amend what I said a minute ago. Yes, mistakes happen, but challenges also occur that are extraneous to the situation.
So you're saying life happens, and people can, get fired, can retire, can get relocated, can get promoted, can get displaced by a virus. God forbid they die.
Yes.
People have life issues or opportunities presented to them where they leave for something better. Does that happen every day? And the answer is, of course it does. And so often I hear, I've made all these applications, I can't get anywhere, and I'm running up into a brick wall, and I keep reaching out to the recruiters and I don't get any response. And I start thinking about what sort of ways can we as coaches and maybe advisors or even candidates get the attention of these parties, and is it worth the effort if they're not going to respond?
Well, we could certainly go back and forth on whether it's worth the effort or not. I think it is to some extent, from the standpoint that, and I'll go back to what we talked about early on, if there's a particular company or small group of companies that you really know you want to work in and that you really know you want to be a part of, then that kind of follow-up, I think, is really important. And as you continue to research that company or companies, you find new names, or you find people that you hadn't heard about before, or what have you, and you just keep that exercise going. You may even work through the people you've been interacting with and say, hey, I just found out about so-and-so, I'd like to reach out to them. Is that okay with you? Well, yeah, why not? Okay. And that can happen. So, continuing to be, a little persistent in a gentle way, I think can pay a lot of dividends. I think there's obviously a point where you get to be a little too much, and then somebody will tell you that, okay, we get that you want to work here, don't have anything happening, trust me, we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Well, and so really it's all about reputation management, and what do you want to be known for?
Right.
And so do I want to be known as a desperate job seeker or an annoying job seeker, or do I want to be known as a resource or a person of value? So I think part of this is managing that reputation, and I think the thing you said was be the bigger person or the better person or whatever that looks like, even after you get the declination letters, right? So that's something to think about. Let me see here.
Yeah. And that's hard too, because you're very focused and centered on your career and your next step and so forth. And you have to just take a moment to step back and say, this can help that. May not feel like it right now, but at the very least, this can help. And I do want to be that person. I do want to be that resource person. So
yeah, and it's hard. I mean, I understand how hard it is to separate your need for employment from your capacity to add value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to hold those things that they're opposing forces, right? And
Yeah.
one of them might get you farther than the other, right? So I recognize that, and there's certainly many resources if you're trying to connect with recruiters or hiring managers on LinkedIn. The search parameters and filters there are really good. You should have no problem at all finding a handful of people to reach out to and have conversations with at your target companies. Now, the challenge that you have is the way in which you reach out. And so if I find that person and then I reach out and say, hey, I'm an applicant for this job and I'd like to know who to talk to about getting an interview. Okay, well, who is that conversation about? And does it add value?
Right.
And the answer probably is no, and you've just established yourself as the reputation of a job seeker. Okay?
Right.
But if I reach out and I say, hey, I have experience in these areas and would like to have a strategic discussion with you about, say, best practices in talent acquisition, then I think that sounds like an interesting conversation. And if you and I have some common connections and that seems like an appropriate dialogue, I'm not sure how that would land, though, Terry. If I'm reaching out to somebody with the best of intentions and not that I've applied for a job, even though I have, how about that fall inside the organization? If you have applied for something but you don't disclose that, and I know there's companies I'm sure that have draconian policies where if you talk to a hiring team during the hiring process, you'll be automatically excluded.
Yeah, I'm aware of a few of those kind of policies as well. It's a bit of a calculated risk, but I have found often that somebody will make a connection with a hiring manager inside an organization, and will say something fascinating or remarkable, or even just something that compels a little bit of interest from that individual. I've seen this happen so many times where that hiring manager will wind up back in the HR team or the talent acquisition team and just, so this person reached out to me and I was really intrigued and I was just impressed with it. And you can go do with it what you want, but I was really interested in what they said and I was intrigued with their energy, and they made a couple of intriguing points that I chatted with them about. And so
with a person.
Yeah.
Okay.
And leading a talent acquisition team over time, one of the golden rules that I learned and that I hold is when you get that kind of feedback from any of your hiring managers inside your organization, get a hold of that person. Get a hold of the person that they just came to you and asked about, because it does two things. One, it validates their sense of being part of the organization, and two, chances are better than average that could lead to at least a reasonable hire. So I always coach my teams. Look, if somebody comes to you, one of the hiring managers, and they've talked to somebody and they're interested in that person for whatever reason, let's go learn more about who that person is and how they might add value to the organization. That's just how I like to do it.
Even if there's no position?
Well, yeah, I don't think it can hurt. You can arrange for a 30-minute informational conversation with that person, and you've lost 30 minutes to a potentially very intriguing person, or maybe not, but you've done your due diligence.
Well, and you've provided candidate experience.
Yeah, because that person is going to go talk to somebody else and say, this happened.
And I felt pretty good about it, that somebody actually took an extra step to reach out to me. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. It creates a great, and again, that speaks to the culture of the organization, that we're willing to do that kind of work, because ultimately we want to know that we are hiring really good people. And if we're doing that extra step of diligence, that's one more step of diligence than any other organization might do in my industry. And that counts not only because just by the law of percentages, we will hire, people that really will fit us well, but it also sends a message to the rest of the industry and to the candidates that would apply to us about who we are. And that's really valuable.
And people carry that with them into the marketplace.
Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And that higher probability then they're actually going to maybe buy your product or service as well. So there's a lot of value in that. So the next question is from John. I am a professional creative in the entertainment and design space. Autodesk interviewed me in a 5-step process. Good for you. Congratulations on the interview, John. I would be doing backflips. But he says no hire. I have 30 years in studio experience, and I'm struggling to get Nike, Adidas, and others to take interest in me. How would you respond to John?
Well, John, first of all, I guess my question to you would be, you went through the process, you talked to a whole group of folk at Autodesk. Have you followed up with them? And have you, had that outreach that says, hey, really appreciate the opportunity to interview. I'm disappointed that I wasn't selected, but I'm sure whoever you did select is going to be outstanding, and best of luck to you. That's something that, again, it's a little counterintuitive, but I would encourage it. As far as some of these other organizations, I would leverage LinkedIn. There are a ton of people. I was on LinkedIn this morning myself, and there are a ton of people at these organizations, and you have to do some sifting. But there are a ton of people at all of the organizations that you just mentioned that are in the space, or either in recruiting, which a lot of them are, or they're in conceivably the work group that you want to work in. And I would not be afraid of just, sending a message and just saying, hey, this is what I do. I'm really good at it. I don't want to say that, but, but this is what I do. This is how long I've been doing it. Love to be able to contribute to what you all are doing. I think I have a lot of experience and background that would be useful. Can we talk? Use LinkedIn to your advantage that way. That to me is a I started recruiting in the early 80s, and man, if I'd had a LinkedIn available to me.
Oh man, don't even get me started. If I had LinkedIn when I first got into sales, oh my word.
Yeah. Right.
It would have been so much easier, and it would have been a lot less expensive. I can assure you that.
Yeah.
Good. So, the only advice I have similar advice for John based on the Autodesk experience is that I look at that not as they rejected you, as they might have accepted somebody else.
Yeah.
So even though it's a declination, they can only hire one person. So it's not that they're rejecting you, it's they're accepting somebody else. So that's just kind of a mindset game. And I know it doesn't take the sting away, but it certainly does allow you to come back with gratitude. Because every interview you get is awesome, right, in this kind of marketplace. And I'm going to take advantage of every interview to do my very best. So, but that said, I think we need to differentiate company from people, because that's all companies really are, as a group of people. And people hire people. And so if I say, hey, I want Nike to get notice of me, then that's about who? That's about me. And you're developing a reputation of being self-interested. And I'm not making a judgment, I'm just making an observation. And the observation is, if you can be others interested and see what they're into, and maybe they're doing, I don't know, you look at their LinkedIn profile and their volunteering time at the food bank. Okay, hey, I'm interested in the work you're doing at the food bank. Maybe you do something outside of your interest in employment and come to them with something that's a passion project of yours. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having a vanity or a passion project you're working on, and to use that as leverage to get a conversation, not for employment, but to talk about the project. And sometimes that's a nice, convenient Switzerland, if you will, that people can lean into and have conversations around without feeling weird. Because if I come to people with my need for employment, they're going to direct me to HR. Nothing against HR, Terry. But
no, understood.
Yeah. But if I'm not in HR, then that doesn't help me. If I'm looking for jobs in talent acquisition, then I'd be all over talent acquisition folk, right? And I think this is fairly good. So there's probably about 10 to 15% of your time you probably spend with talent acquisition. The balance in networking with people that are in a position of power to actually hire somebody like you. Good. Thank you, Erica. Hi, Erica. Erica's on the line. Good to see you. Let's see. Yeah, well, and recognize, I think, today, Terry, that many companies are not responsive. They're trying to formulate their reopening strategies. There may be some real serious reorganizing going on. So I would not disengage with the marketplace. I would actually double down on my engagement, because there may be people either filtered into or out of some really important positions inside these companies you want to work for. And I would be trying to reach out to as many people as I could to get informational meetings set up.
Yep.
As long as we're still work from home, because I can feel it now. There's things starting to open up, and I can see there's going to be dissonance again, where people are going to have competing responsibilities and not be available to do the informationals.
I think that's reasonable, but I totally agree with you. I think now's the time to double down and just really try to make as much connection as you can, and that's going to be a bit of a percentage game based on what you're saying about people being preoccupied with other elements. But it's going to be, I think it's going to be valuable in the long run, because I think as we do start coming out of this and things do start to settle down and we do start to see how work sifts out and how people sift out and how they address or don't address returning to work and so forth, I think we're going to see dynamics starting to open back up a little bit. And again, it's a big nut to crack with all the people that are out of work, but I think it's doable. I think we are going to have to be so cautious just because of the potential risks involved. But if we really, as leaders, if we really approach it well and we really try to do the right work with our folks and with our systems, I think I think there's a lot of opportunity to be had.
Excellent. And I see my good friend Cleon Cox in the chat. I don't know if you know Cleon, Terry, but you probably should.
Okay.
He's called the Networking Whisperer. And he's a Toastmasters advocate, and he's a wonderful man that you should probably know. Let me see here. Let's see. My advice to all: I take classes and search to stay fresh, up to date, relevant. Yep, absolutely. That's on my Covey 7 Habits. Sharpen the saw.
Yep.
Hello from Los Angeles. Hi, Los Angeles. Any virtual job fairs? That's a good point, Terry. I don't know if you or anyone you know is engaged in virtual career fairs or job fairs of any kind, virtual hiring events. Call them what you want. Have you heard any scuttlebutt or any kind of ideas around that?
Well, I have, and actually, I believe that Lee Hecht Harrison just ran one recently. I think again, it's an interesting point, because virtual job fairs were happening 2-3 years ago. Virtual job fairs are not new, and they are certainly not unique anymore. They were at one time. It was like people said, "What's a virtual job fair?" Now, virtual job fairs are very well known, and because of the circumstances, I think we're going to see that escalate substantially over the next many months. And so, I don't have any particular wisdom as to who or when or any of that sort of thing, but it was a theme for the last several years, and there's a ton of logic to them, that is only now even more acute because of the situation. But I think, I would recommend so here's an interesting thing. I would recommend looking at organizations that particularly are involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there is an ongoing, very strong need in that space. There have been organizations, NSBE is a good example, SHIP is a good example, of groups that do already have online virtual job fairs, and will, I think, find that activity even more robust. So I think it's probably something where you can Google some combination of virtual job fair, virtual career fair, or what have you, and I feel confident that there's going to be a lot of activity in that space.
Well, I don't see how there can't be. Well, I mean, so I guess the other side of that is just to think, hey, if and this is a strategy I've talked to a lot of people about, is just creating your own meetup. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a job fair, why don't you create your own meetup where you say, okay, hey, I want to talk best practices around, I don't know, video production. I saw that, one of the guys was in a studio video setting. Great. Well, maybe there's a tool or a technique or something you could do to invite people in your LinkedIn network to come to this meetup, and just create for yourself your own networking group that way. And so it's a selfish ambition for sure, but it's a project. And so if we have a vanity, personal interest, and kind of meetup like that, I think that would fall really well.
That's a great idea. Huh.
I mean, that's how associations get started in the first place, isn't it? Around some affinity.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
And so, I've always wanted to start an affinity on, how do we bypass the ATS, right? How do we, yeah, anyway. Let's see. Any great suggestion for classes search to pursue in Marcom? I don't know of any. I'm not in that space per se. No. I really always take, when someone comes to me and says, hey, I need an education or I need a certification, what I found is that's typically if somebody, typically a talent acquisition recruiter, no offense, again, Terry, tells them, hey, these other people I've got have this certification and you don't. So I'm adding them to my qualified candidates list and not you. And so I wonder at some point, Terry, is the ATS and the talent acquisition function really becoming more of a filtering mechanism, right? And is it a binary thing? I hate to say it that way, but what are your perspectives on that?
No, that's a fair observation. And again, I'm going to fall back on it depends. It depends on who's operating those systems and what the rules of engagement are inside that organization. I mean, there are some organizations and some, people, managers, whatever, however you want to describe that characteristic, that simply say, I need a way to distinguish between yes and no. I'll use that. May not necessarily be legit. And one of the things I always coach my talent acquisition people on is get under the surface on that. Let's really call it what it is. I mean, and especially so, a really good example is in the software world, right? I mean, it's not been that long ago that, software developers had to have bachelor's degree in computer science, et cetera. The internet world, right, has proven that that's not always necessarily the case. And it's taken, my organization I was describing a while ago, we had over 150 software engineers. Not all of them had Bachelor of Science in computer, and so forth. A lot of them came out of these private schools that are popping up that are teaching, cutting edge software development skills with particular tool sets and so forth that are right now necessary in web development. And yeah, we hired folks and we paid them well. We paid them the market rate that didn't necessarily have the degree, but had such a skill set and had such an affinity and a capacity for that work that you couldn't say no. So yeah, it going back to it depends. It depends on the hiring environment and the rules of engagement and the expectations. So
perfect. Well, I think we've run up to a little bit over an hour here in 15 minutes, Terry. Maybe we should just wrap it up. Any final parting thoughts or encouragement for people looking right now?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel tough. It really does. We are in the midst of something that none of us could have ever. Well, let's restate that we knew could have been a possibility, but we just didn't grapple with it the way maybe we could have. So now we're in it, and we're going over the falls in a barrel. But I believe that it is finite. It is that, this is an amazing business world that we live in. It's been running on giant cylinders for month over month, year over year. In some ways, you almost had to suspect something like this would happen. And maybe it's more drastic and more dramatic than we would ever have imagined it to be. But we are incredibly resilient as a society. And we as people, as job seekers, as professionals, we need to embrace that same sense of resilience. And just, it's not going to be as easy as it was, but it's not impossible. So hang in, be tough, and and allow yourself the opportunity to take a deep breath from time to time. Smell the roses or the coffee brewing or whatever it is that feels good for you, and give yourself the chance to do that. And we will do this. We'll get through this together, and we will be good.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us again today for this session of Career Happy Hour on Fridays at 3 p.m. Pacific Time. Every week we'll be here to support your success and provide you free coaching. So, share this with friends that you know. And in fact, if wherever you're joining from, grab that share button and share it with your network, or tag somebody in the comments that you think might find this conversation valuable. I think it's a great way to go. The other thing I would suggest is I do have a podcast. It's called Job Seekers Radio. You can find it on my profile on LinkedIn, but just go to jobseekersradio.com and you can listen. It's free. I like free. And if you're interested, we also have at that same link a resource called The Anatomy of a Networking Conversation. So if you have not yet listened to the podcast, or you haven't downloaded that resource, then by all means, please go ahead and take advantage of it. Terry, thanks so much again.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great weekend, and I'm sure we'll talk again real soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. This has been a great experience. I appreciate it very much.
You bet. Take care. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this episode of FAQ Friday Career Happy Hour. We'll see you again next week.